Thank you, Catherine. Good morning, everyone. As Catherine said, I'm Laurel Broten, CEO of Invest in Canada, which is Canada's investment promotion and attraction agency. Merci, Catherine, pour cette introduction. Bonjour à tous. Je m'appelle Laurel Broten et je suis la PDG d'Investir au Canada, l'agence de promotion des investissements au Canada. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I am so pleased to be back in Toronto and joining the discussions here at Toronto Global Forum because this year's theme, Scaling for a Sustainable Future, is one that I am passionate about and is completely aligned with the work that my team and I do every day as we seek out global companies to invest in Canada. In the work we do on behalf of Canadians, I have the benefit of speaking to global CEOs across a range of geographies, sectors, and I hear one clear message. The world is changing. More than ever, companies are looking at their impact, customers and shareholders are demanding more sustainable products, and people are directly feeling the impact of climate change. Dans mes fonctions, j'ai l'occasion de m'entretenir avec des PDG de différents pays et secteurs et j'entends un message clair. Nous sommes dans un monde de changement. Plus que jamais, les entreprises sont conscieusement de leur impact, les clients et les actionnaires exigent des produits plus durables et les gens ressentent directement l'impact du changement climatique. We are undergoing a massive transformation that's revolutionizing every industry, from the types of technologies we need, the way we operate, to the way we get products to market. As a result, there are new demands as well as expectations on the energy systems that allow all this to take place around the world every day. While this creates enormous challenges, it also creates enormous opportunities. Opportunities for our people and technologies to be providers of solutions the world so badly needs. For our industries to capitalize on new demands for sustainable offerings, and for Canada, as a proud energy nation, to continue to power the world. Si cette situation crée d'énormes défis, elle crée également d'énormes opportunités. Des opportunités pour nos citoyens et nos technologies devenir des fournisseurs de solutions dans le monde à tant besoin. Pour nos industries de tirer partir de nouvelles demandes et pour le Canada, en tant que fière nation énergétique, de continuer à alimenter le monde en énergie. Le besoin du monde évolue et le Canada a ce dont le monde a besoin. Now for the Canadians in the room. I know we have a tendency to be humble, and we may underestimate the importance of our country's role in this sustainable transition. So let me share why I am so certain we are up for it. Not only does Canada have the resources, the talent, and the innovation to make an ideal destination for sustainable projects, it has also created the economic conditions to make it possible. And Canada's advantages have already become recognized globally as major factors for companies looking to locate projects. In fact, Rystad Energy ranks Canada second globally for favorable conditions for green energy projects. And Bloomberg NEF has placed Canada's EV battery supply chain first in the world. Last year, Canada had a record year in sustainable project investments. Nearly 1/3 of all foreign investments made in Canada last year was in sustainable projects, which is a 102% increase year over year. L'année dernière, le Canada a connu une année record en matière d'investissement dans des projets durables. Près d'un tiers de tous les investissements étrangers réalisés au Canada concernaient des projets durables. Il s'agit d'une augmentation incroyable de 102% d'une année à l'autre. The needs of the world are changing, and Canada has what the world needs. All across the country, we are seeing opportunity come to life. From the Atlantic province's leadership in wind energy and green hydrogen production, to Alberta's carbon capture and storage expertise, the Prairie's many investment in sustainable alternative proteins and ag tech innovations, Quebec and Ontario's world-leading EV battery supply chain, British Columbia's sustainable transportation, and the North's mining and exploration. While we are witnessing real progress and successes, there is an urgency at play that simply cannot be ignored. The funding gap between where we are right now and where we need to be to achieve industrial sustainability is in the trillions of dollars. Innovating and implementing new sustainable pathways and solutions are capital-intensive endeavors and will take time to bridge the gap to commercial viability. For transformation at this scale, we are talking about both the private and public sectors must be engaged and active. We need industry to continue to innovate and find the solutions that will get us to a net zero economy. At the same time, governments have a role to play in making it possible for the private sector to get these transformative projects off the ground by incentivizing new sustainable solutions, development to bridge the financing gap. Canada, both at the federal and provincial level, is doing that. Canada is at the table with real solutions that help companies de-risk these projects, and we cannot stop. That's why I'm so excited to be here today to speak with our expert panelists about de-risking sustainable investments, investments which are imperative to drive long-term economic growth, innovation, and productivity, as well as strategic opportunity. It's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. First up is Pia Haak, Chief Investment Officer at Swedbank Robur. In her role at one of Scandinavia's largest mutual fund managers, she is responsible for ensuring the firm's investment strategies align with its commitment to sustainability. Welcome, Pia. Next is Tamsin Ballard in her role as Chief Initiatives Officer at the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. She is focused on investor collaboration and initiatives that encompass all aspects of responsible investment under the 6 principles. And last, but certainly not least, is Ehren, CEO of Canada Infrastructure Bank, where he oversees CIB's $10 billion growth plan, a budget that prioritizes investments in clean power, green infrastructure, and zero-emission transit. Thank you, and now let's get to the conversation.
Thank you.
Well, welcome. And I am excited about the conversation. It's critical that we figure out these pathways. I spoke a minute ago about significant investments that the energy transition requires and how at Invest in Canada, we see this as a real opportunity to partner with global companies to facilitate and accelerate that transition. All three of you represent or work with investors, but in different ecosystems, which gives you a really unique perspective. So I'm going to ask the same question to all of you. Can you tell us a little bit about your current role and how the pursuit of sustainability has been impacting how you operate? And maybe I'll start close to home if I can, and I'll start with Ehren to get the ball rolling.
Home field advantage. Thank you, Laurel. Thanks. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm going to just try and keep Minister Champagne's energy on the stage. I'm going to stay similarly illuminated. The Infrastructure Bank was created about 6 or 7 years ago with the exact idea, Laurel, that you talked about in your opening comments. There is a gap between, on the one hand, government's aspirations for the kind of large-scale infrastructure we need to manage what is a new industrial revolution, to meet the needs of our rapidly changing economy on the one side, and pools of capital on the other hand, who are keen to invest in these types of projects, but also see real barriers in the significant upfront capital cost and in the risk or uncertainty in ramp up. And we'll talk more about this, I think, through our conversation. But the idea of the bank, we're a Crown corporation, we were created, you talked about the growth plan, which was our first 3 years, our first $10 billion of investment. We're past that now. We're into the second tranche, if you will. In total, though, the government of Canada set aside $35 billion of taxpayer money. And the idea is we invest that money. We make loans or equity investments in projects. We are meant to earn a return. My colleague from the South African Development Bank, actually, we could trade notes because we're very similar. The idea of the CIB is if we can invest alongside pools of private capital, and alongside other governments, levels of government, provinces, municipalities, and the federal government, we can get more built faster by being that slice in the middle, that gap filler that helps share the early ramp-up risk, that helps defray the huge upfront capital costs of these projects we're the most patient of investors. We're very long-term, and we have a lower hurdle rate than the rest of the market. So we can be a tranche that helps make projects go from stuck to happening. That's the idea of the bank.
Great. Well, Pia, why don't I come over to you?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. You mentioned the introduction, and maybe just to add on that, you said we're the largest fund company in the Nordic region, and we're focusing on public equities, bonds, and corporate bonds. And we're managing money for 4 million clients, and 2/3 of that is from the retail side, and 1/3 is institutional. And so my role is, together with 90 specialists, to manage this money in the best ways. We have around 90 funds and over 100 discretionary mandates that we're taking care of. So, of course, that's a huge privilege, but also a big responsibility. And it gives us a good ground to actually do impact in terms of sustainability. And it's really in our DNA as a fund company, being a part in the Nordics, where I believe that we can say that we're in the forefront. So it's a part of our DNA. We launched our first sustainable fund in the beginning of the 80s, and the company was founded in 67. And of course, it has changed. The sustainability, I've been in the industry for 30 years, and you can't compare it where we are at today. So a lot has happened related to regulations that we talked about a little bit over a coffee here, with all the data, the quality of data, the need to handle it. And of course, it has changed the way we think about philosophy of how to do our investment, about investment processes, but also about people and educating people around this important topic.
Great, thank you. Well, Tamsin, now you will be able to give us a very big perspective from the role that you play. So the same question to you. I think you live and breathe sustainability every single day. So.
Thank you. Yes, very much so. So we're a UN-supported membership organisation focused on the achievement of a sustainable financial system. We have members covering about 100 different markets, over 5,000 different members, including asset owners, investment managers, and financial service providers. And collectively, they represent, they manage around 128 trillion US dollars of assets under management. And maybe just picking up on Pia's point on the progress that we've seen. So we were established around 18 years ago, and it's astonishing to think how the market has changed in that time. So responsible investment is now largely mainstreamed in financial practice. It's covering about 50% of managed capital globally. Likewise, on financial regulation and sustainability reporting, so getting that comparable, consistent and transparent data. And we're seeing that in major economies across the world now, either being mandated or being discussed at the moment. Maybe just to say a bit about the direction we're heading in. So we just recently launched our new strategy, which was designed very much in consultation with our members and reflecting kind of where the industry needs are. We have 4 different levers within that, but maybe 2 I wanted to highlight is one is around amplifying impact through collaboration. And I'll probably again come back to this a few times on the importance of collaboration. So bringing our signatories together in terms of, well, how do we address these system level risks on climate change, on nature loss? How do we come together to manage those risks, but also around maximizing the long-term value of assets, and also around strengthening the enabling policy environment? So engaging with government, engaging with financial actors in terms of getting the right policies, the right frameworks in place. And maybe then the last thing I'll just touch on. Last week, we held actually here in Toronto our Global Responsible Investment Conference, PRI in person, and it was attended by over 1,700 investors, financial service providers, and other stakeholders. And 3 things that really came out for me through that conference is, one, the urgency of action. So really recognizing the material risks and threats, also opportunities in responding to climate change, to biodiversity loss, and the need to act quickly. I think Senator Galvez at the conference said, to paraphrase her, we need to now sprint a marathon and we're late. So I think that was a key message coming through. Another on the strengthening the enabling environment, and we're delighted to have the Deputy Prime Minister announce Canada's, the Canadian government's mandatory disclosure and taxonomy plan. So again, moving forward on that. And finally, around collaboration, it's collaboration between investors and companies, between investors and governments. That's the way that we're going to be able to make the transition in the timeframe that we've got.
Great. Well, we'll come back to you to talk a little bit more about some of those policy ecosystems. But I want to jump over to Pia and really talk about how we feel the urgency. We know that we need to move quickly. How do we mobilize capital for green investments without compromising on profitability? What is the lens that you look at? What have you seen as successful mitigation tools, financial structures, or pieces that help you make the decisions that you want to make, but you need to have some parameters around it to have a successful outcome?
Yeah, could I briefly just comment on what you said? I think a lot, we need to measure things and to get things done. And by 2018, we have 90 portfolio managers. So we introduced our incentive system that 50% is the return of the fund and 50% is the way that the portfolio manager is actually working with sustainability, both having the dialogue with the companies, engaging, etc. So I think that comes from the top, and if you set high goals, you get people working on it as well. So that has made a big change for us, I must say. And then coming back to your question, it's not an easy answer to that one, but of course complexity should not be an excuse not to act. And since we are investing into the public market, can we do something? I think there is a lot that we can do. We work on 3 different layers in terms of strategy, both with exclusion of companies that don't live up to the standards that we have set. We work with inclusion of companies, finding the best business models, looking at doing really deep due diligence and asking the right questions and pushing the transition forward. And of course, we can do a lot. You talked about collaboration. That's a very big part for us as well. Collaborating with other investors in net zero asset managers. It could be access to medicine for emerging market areas, for instance, and also related to human rights and children's rights. And we're engaged in all of them. And for being a Swedish company, we can also be active on nomination committees, ensuring the right board of directors, and also, of course, using our voting and the power that we have in AGMs. So it's a lot that you can do, even though it seems like you're managing just listed equities or bonds, but there is actually quite a lot to do.
Great. Well, you've given a lot of ideas to our audience of how they can get more actively engaged in some of these areas. I'm going to come to you, Ehren, because I know you're thinking about this all the time, getting that capital mobilized, and needing those additional financial structures and policies, I think certainly are driving the CIB agenda.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, Pia, of course, you're coming at it from a market shaping view. I'm almost at the other end of the telescope because everything we do is project finance based. So there's a new renewable project, a battery storage project, a hydrogen development project, and we're investing in a tranche, either equity or some kind of subordinated debt to help be that gap filler in the project. But you're right. I think the way we think about it is like this. First, on our side, we very much follow a same ethos you're describing, Pia, at the corporate level. That is, all of our people's return thresholds are impact-based. It's tons of GHG emissions reduced. It's number of new homes connected to broadband. It's number of new people who can use transit. They're all linked actually to the UN SDGs in some way, shape, or form. Many of them are climate or sustainability related, but not all. There's also trade and transportation corridors to grow economic prosperity for the country. But we have 5 core outcome metrics. I've named them all except, new housing starts. So the infrastructure that enables housing. So we measure our managing directors, our investors, based on their delivery. And when we think of an investment and we talk about ROI, the R in our ROI calculation is actually one of those 5 metrics. We look at financial returns second. And there we really think about being self-financing, earning enough in returns on a risk-adjusted basis that over time we can keep reinvesting this money on behalf of taxpayers. But that's our hurdle rate really, is be financially self-sustaining, have our interest exceed our losses over time, because there will be losses. So we're trying to make enough money to cover our losses and be self-sustaining. But otherwise, we look at outcome metrics when we make an investment. And I think what that allows us to do is we look at deals very differently than other investors, and it allows us to fill a gap. But Laurel, I think the biggest learning we've had, and I mentioned this in my intro, is how many of these projects get stuck because of ramp up risk. And you're talking about sustainable investments, and I'm focused on the infrastructure part of that. They face huge upfront capital costs and very slow ramp up. If the four of us decided to start a new company, I don't know, a district energy company, you're going to put a whole bunch of steel in the ground and you're building it for future development of over the next 30 to 50 years of that city. And you're making long-term predictions about population growth and housing density and a whole bunch of things that at a firm level are very hard to do. What the CIB can do is help to smooth that. And if it takes a few extra years for that development to happen, that's okay. We can help insulate other investors so that they can make those investments. And that's true on hydrogen refueling networks and port expansion, as I talked about earlier. But on the climate side, it's true on EV charging and building retrofits and district energy and a whole bunch of these markets. There's a big ramp up risk over a decade or so. And their assets actually, Pia, I think if you looked at them over their life, they're very investable. The challenge is in getting to maturity and getting up that curve. So that's where we're really focused.
Great. So we've talked about market forming. We've talked about the bottom up. Pia, you want to jump in? I'm going to let you jump in. And then
I just wanted to
Tamsin.
comment on that because, as I mentioned, today we invest in daily liquidity. But I think it's about to change in Europe, that we will get a more democratization of private investments, and I think it's definitely needed. And it's a great investment opportunity for all of us, but to be able to slice it into different portions and to be able to handle the liquidity as well. So I think we're getting there, and it's a very important part. We need private capital to finance the transition, definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely. Tamsin, now I'm going to get your broader perspective or bigger perspective on this. And I felt very hopeful as I'm listening to our first two panelists, like these are good lessons for folks to learn. And it really, there is a lot of activity out in the world trying to drive this agenda. So give us your perspective.
Thanks. Well, look, just to start by saying absolutely agree, and investors are at the table. So investors as fiduciary, their aim is around enhancing and protecting their overall returns. And that requires really understanding and addressing where you see major current and emerging risks. Climate change very much ticks that box. It's a material system level threat, but also it's a generational opportunity in terms of the investments. And we see this, you were mentioning before about the trillions of dollars there. The IEA estimates just on clean energy alone that you need around $4.5 trillion US of investment per year by 2030 to be on track for net zero. And good news is actually that transition is starting to happen. So I think this year, clean energy investments around 1.7 trillion, whereas fossil fuel investments around 1 trillion. So we're seeing kind of the clean energy side advancing now ahead of the fossil fuels. And just maybe an illustration of investors acting. So one of the initiatives that we support, the UN-convened Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, and this is 88 asset owners representing around $9.5 trillion US. And collectively, last year they allocated around $555 billion to climate solutions. So investors coming to the table and they are aligning capital with this. The challenge is that they can't go as fast as required or at the scale that's required because of the enabling environment. So they need that enabling policy environment to remove barriers and really unlock this next phase of the transition. Within that, there are probably three categories of policies that really matter. So the first is around real economy policy. Now, an illustration of this, you might have heard as we run up to the next UN climate conference, reference to nationally determined contributions. And these are effectively country plans that translate the Paris Agreement into what this means for that country. And we're calling on governments to be really ambitious with these plans, which are due for next year, and really provide that platform for investment that's aligned with the 1.5 pathway and setting out the right legislation, policy reforms, the transition plans, which enables investors to crowd round that. Financial policy, also absolutely critical. So whether in terms of mandatory ISSB aligned disclosure through to giving really clear guidance on what does Paris-aligned transition planning look like for investors and corporates, setting that out at that level. And then in terms of multilateral policy, so this ranges from the multilateral development banks, but through to, again, thinking about the UN conference next month in Azerbaijan. They're going to be negotiating the new climate finance deal and really making sure there's a really clear signal in there on the role for private finance, as well as making sure that it meets the needs of emerging markets and developing countries. And maybe just to finish on a bit of a positive note, that we are seeing change. It's just not happening as quickly as we need to. But, if you look at the major economies around the world, really vying now to get a share of the global clean energy future. And they're taking different approaches on that. So the US is taking very much an industrial policy approach with the Inflation Reduction Act. If you look at the EU, it's much more of a regulatory focus. So looking at carbon border adjustment mechanisms, for example. At the international level, last year in Dubai, the last UN climate change conference, governments agreed that we need policy frameworks that support tripling of renewable energy capacity, doubling of energy efficiency improvements by 2030, and the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, which are really slowing down the transition. And they're costing $7 trillion of public finance. So, there is movement happening, but I think on both sides, we just need to really accelerate back to the urgency of action.
Yes, absolutely. Ehren, I'm going to come to you. You would have the opportunity to see a lot of activity taking place, sustainable investing. What do you believe are some of the trends that you're seeing, and where do you think some of the growth opportunities are over the next 5 or so years?
Well, I'll give the Canadian lens as that's the part of the world, and we are incredibly, as your intro did such a good job of describing, we are really privileged and are blessed with the combination of geography, a good policy framework, and a great institutional investing pool. We have some of the largest pensions, so we have a whole bunch of the ingredients. The trends we're seeing are a lot of them are around how do you think about Canada as an energy superpower in that emerging world. And as you said, you're on the East Coast. You think of what do we have on the East Coast? It's pretty flat, very windy, not super populous, lots of room for wind both on and offshore, and then you can turn that into lots of stuff. Hydrogen that the world might need, clean steel that the world might need, data centers that the world might like. The product at the end of but what we have is a unique asset. So the trend we're seeing here in Canada is across the country. That's my East Coast example. I could do the same in the West or in the prairies as you did in your intro. What we're seeing is, I think, the Canadian sector looking beyond our borders at where can we contribute not only to meeting Canada's goals, but how can we be part of the world? I think hydrogen development, both the East and the West Coast, is one of those examples, not only for use in electricity generation, but I think of aviation fuel, shipping, some of the harder to decarbonize parts of our economy. There's really interesting things happening in Canada around those. I think we have a chance to be leaders there. There's really interesting things happening around storage of all its forms, because if we're going to electrify everything, we need more and more forms of storage, whether that's the next generation of hydro, because hydro is a form of storage, but also batteries, where across the country you're seeing a lot more investment in those things. Again, all of them, I think, are all the examples I'm giving are about both setting Canada up for success, but also where can we play globally and how can we be part of globally global solutions. And that's what we're seeing and what we get excited about as the CIB. And I see right here when we have partners like the EDC who help us take what we can do well here in Canada and take that beyond our borders. That's where the Canadian opportunity is. I think we can meet our own aspirations and goals and be above our weight on the global stage if we do this right.
Absolutely. I mean, Canada's always been an energy powerhouse and a purveyor of solutions to the world. And I think those more modern green solutions are where we are exclusively focused now, with lots of attention and lots of folks looking at, well, I can come establish in Canada and sell that around the world. And I know that we speak often to folks in the leadership out of Scandinavian countries. So jump to you in terms of Swedbank, you must also be seeing that same opportunity. And what are the trend lines that you're observing?
Yeah, definitely. Just comment on that. I mean, a lot is going on in terms of new energy and big ambitions related to reducing carbon emission from making new batteries from Northvolt up in the north. We have Stegra, former H2 Green Steel, that's also a big part. So a lot is going on in that area. And I think that is a trend that needs to continue, even though there will be bumpy roads and there will be challenges, but we need to overcome them, and we need the politicians to set the ground and give us the good sort of stability as well. And we really need to build on entrepreneurship. So let's keep to that. But in terms of trends going forward, and if you look at asset management industry, you mentioned everyone was sitting around the table and everyone is agreeing. And I believe we see the same, both from clients, companies, and investors. And it's very encouraging to see that the young generation is not, they're really demanding it. It's not, they are asking the right question to push us even further. And that's very positive, and I think that will continue. And I think regulations, being in Europe, they will continue to come. And it will mean, I mean, sometimes you feel like, oh, it's a burden, but also there is great business opportunity, and it's also pushing us as an industry to do more. So I think we'll see big developments there, both in terms of reporting, bringing transparency and comparability with the data that we so often mention and so often are struggling with, but we need to work with that. And in terms of assets as well, I mean, when I started 30 years ago, everyone was focusing on where is the company listed, and you bought into a US fund or a Japanese fund, etc. And now I think it's more about looking at the mega trends, like what's going on in demographics, what's happening related to geopolitics and security, climate and nature, etc. So I think it's a new way of investing and a new way that our clients are appreciating and want us to continue with. So I think in terms of that, you will see more investments into clean energy, to water, to biodiversity, nature, etc. So I see that as a big area to grow as well.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned a bumpy road, and I think that's something that we need to talk frankly about. This is a size and scale of a revolution that is beyond the Industrial Revolution, and that took over 100 years, and we want people to move very quickly. So, Ehren, I want to come to you. I mean, what are some of the challenges that we need to really lean in to address to continue this and to get over those bumps?
Well, I think as Tamsin has pointed out, I think one of the fundamentals is we've got to keep managing the pace of change or the rate of change. And, you know, there's a carrot and a stick happening at all times, right? So what we're trying to do is help investors get over their hurdle rate. We're a carrot, if you will. I'm going to help make this project more affordable. At the same time, they're getting squeezed by ever increasing stringency and regulations. And I think challenge number one is those two things have to move in parallel. And so we can't incentivize someone to invest. Like you talked about carbon capture, which is, I think, game-changing technology for the world. And again, a place where Canada can really lead. Carbon capture technology only works when there is both carrot and stick. There's regulatory pressure and stringency requirements that force change, and there's pools of capital like ours, like FIAs, like institutional investors who are willing to take a risk within reason. And so moving those two things at the same pace and continuing, it requires willpower and it requires coordination. And frankly, it requires governments and the private sector to act together in a way we haven't always been great at. That's number one. Number two, I do think time frames and time horizons have to change. Like the infrastructure we're building, whether it's clean power or transmission grid, what we're seeing, look at what's happened in Ontario, our nuclear assets, for instance. We built them all. We thought they had 30 or 40 year lives. They're into year 50 and still going strong and being renewed for even longer. And as we look ahead, I think of the transmission grid we're going to need. We're making those investments now for incredibly long time frames. And that's great. Governments are good at that. Investors, I think, have to keep getting better at longer time horizon investments. And that's shifting money to things that last longer. So I think those are some of the macro challenges that we're dealing with, is how do you keep moving both carrots and sticks at the same time? How do you keep stretching time horizons for investors to look at the useful life of these assets? Both of those changes, I think, are what it's going to take to go faster, as Tamsin correctly points out, needs to happen.
Great. Tamsin, I'm going to come to you. A little snapshot on any additional challenges that you want to have us think about and lean into.
So first of all, very much agree with everything that Ehren was saying. I think maybe one of the really big challenges is going to be how the transition is managed, because there is going to be pushback. You know, we're already seeing pushback to the net zero transition and the policies that come with it. You know, whether it's some of the anti-ESG bills in some of the US states through to farmers protesting in Europe. So I think one of the key things is how, and again, coming back to governments, but how this is managed, and, you know, making sure that, you know, across different societal groups, sectors are brought to the table in terms of, you know, for governments to understand, well, where might there be some adverse impacts and how can they be addressed? And that requires a whole of government approach in terms of managing that and using all of the different policy levers. So, you know, addressing externalities, thinking about transition assistance. And I think coming back to the role of investors within this, you know, they have a critical role to play. They have a seat at the table on this. And one of the things that we're seeing increasingly coming from investors, a real interest in engaging on policy. You know, there's recognition is there that you have to have that enabling policy environment, and they want to get involved. So whether that's in terms of the engagement with investee companies around their corporate climate lobbying, so, you know, where either directly or indirectly through trade associations, companies may be, you know, delaying, diluting, blocking the kind of policy measures, which is not in line with investors' interests of having a fast and stable transition. Or we're seeing it in terms of investors wanting to actively engage with governments. So, for example, there's the Global Investor Statement that's going to be presented to governments next month, which I think around 530 investors, $29 trillion of AUM, saying, come on, governments, we need the right policy. We're ready to act, but we need the right policy framework. The Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance recently put out a similar call to action. And we've got a group of 27 investors working with us through this collaborative sovereign engagement, working with the Australian government in terms of how to support them to get those right policy frameworks in place. So you need governments to act and you need investors at the table to kind of share their expertise on that.
Yeah.
Great. I'm going to come to you, Pia, and you're going to get a double question. You get to talk about challenges, and then we're going to switch over to opportunities. I notice our time is moving very quickly. So challenges, and then we'll move to hopeful opportunities and leave folks with some positive perspective.
Okay, well, great. Just briefly I totally agree what my panelist colleagues here have said already. But with green transition, we really need secure energy production, and we need to attract capital, which is challenging with all the geopolitical situation, etc. And we also need to recruit competence, and we need to get them to stay and really incentivize and encourage entrepreneurship. And that is an area that is sort of a little bit challenging from time to time. But it's much more fun to speak of what you said, the opportunities that we have. And I do believe we have the investment opportunity of our lifetime. I think opportunities are to be found everywhere, cross sectors, cross regions, in emerging market and in developed market. And one particular area which fits in very well to what we've talked about already is the hard to abate sector, where 1/3 of emission is coming from. And here we're talking about companies related to transportation, to infrastructure, of course, and the companies that will build the future city and the most efficient cities that we can have and prosper and live in. So I stop there and leave the floor to the rest as well.
Thank you, Pia. You are making us hopeful. I'm going to come to you, Tamsin, and then I'll go to Ehren.
Thanks. Well, I'll be very brief. I mean, I think probably the main thing is the fact that we've got the direction of travel now. Everyone who needs to be acting knows they now need to be acting. We know the different technologies that are required. And just to do a bit of a plug on the nature side on that as well, you know, trees, they work. They've always worked. So we know these things. So that direction of travel is clear now. And, you know, start acting now and you're going to be much more resilient for an uncertain future, whether that's uncertainty because of the climate science, because of regulation change, etc. So I feel optimistic that this can happen. It can happen within the time frame that we've got, but it does need all actors to come together to collaborate on that.
Yeah, I think the description of the direction of travel is really spot on. I mean, I know sometimes it can seem like a massive challenge ahead of us, but we also need to roll back and think about, you know, I've been having these conversations for many, many years. 20 years ago, and hard to believe only 20 years ago, if you talked about triple bottom line, ESG, people didn't want to talk to you. And if they knew what you were talking about, they weren't that interested in it. Yep. So we've come a long way. We do have everybody at the table. The conversations are exciting and everybody is leaning in and looking for those solutions. So Ehren, you're at the heart of it in Canada, trying to help us move ahead. Give us your positive opportunities.
Well, I think you're exactly right. And you take the CIB just as a case study. We were created 6 years ago. Our first employee started, and we're up to 75 investments and about 13.5 or 14 billion of our money invested in what is $40 billion worth of projects, all with a sustainable lens on them. And so we have driven $40 billion of investment into the space just in Canada in the last few years. And I think the opportunity is, first of all, we're not unique. As I said, I had a colleague from the Development Bank of Southern Africa on this stage an hour ago. Nordbank was created in the 1950s. We've learned a lot from them. The UK has an infrastructure bank. Ontario has their Building Ontario Fund. A lot of governments. What I'm saying is I think there's a broad recognition that the only way to scale our ambition, as the conference says, is going to be by bringing in other pools of capital. Governments can't afford to do this all themselves. They just can't. And that's good, actually, because it means we know that we need a different approach. We need an approach that can draw in pools of capital, get private investors aligned. So a little sliver like us and like Nordbank and like the UKIB and CEFC in Australia and many others, a little sliver of government money can go a long way. You can see that multiplier effect. And so I think the opportunity is if we can keep finding ways to create that collaboration between public and private and draw in private investment to meet our needs, we can get the acceleration that Tamsin describes.
Great. Well, you do need everyone at the table, and increasingly everyone is at the table with various different perspectives. And I want to thank the IEFA for bringing this to yet a different audience, because many of the folks, we probably get a chance to speak to the folks that are very engaged in the topic every day. But, you know, for Canadians that are in the audience, we only speak to companies about coming to Canada who are willing and engaged in sustainable opportunities, and we have no shortage of folks to talk to. There are lots and lots of initiatives out there that can help us get to where we need to get to. But as we've been talking about today, that financing gap, that initial gap to get it to where it needs to be is crucial. So one last word to each of you. Thank you for being here today. And I'm just going to we're in a lightning round now because we got 40 seconds left. So one thing that you didn't get a chance to have our audience hear that you want them to know.
I think I will just go back on saying it's collaboration. It's all actors coming together and we can do this.
Great. Ehren.
I think if we keep focused on outcomes and thinking about how do we deliver. You said triple bottom line. I haven't heard that expression.
That was an old one.
That's an old one.
A long time ago.
But it's this. But the idea hasn't gone away. Continuing to focus on how do we deliver both impact and returns, I think, is going to get all of us moving the way we want to go.
Yeah.
And profitability and sustainability goes hand in hand with long-term investment.
Great. So for all the business leaders in the audience, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you to the IFA for letting us talk about this, and have a great rest of your conference.
Thank you.
Thank you.